Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. The post was buried in an obscure paranormal forum, the kind that housed everything from Slenderman sightings to haunted basement confessions. Most of it was nonsense. But something about this thread made Josh stop scrolling. There's a forest in the Appalachian Mountains filled with dolls, not just lost toys, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, dangling from branches, buried in the undergrowth, sitting on tree stumps like they're waiting for someone. And at night, they move. Josh's eyes flicked to the grainy photos attached. Dolls slumped against trees, their plastic faces weathered by time. Some were headless. Others had jagged carvings on their foreheads, crude symbols that sent a shiver up his spine. But the worst part, every single doll was missing its eyes. Dave leaned over his shoulder, crunching a chip loudly. Creepy, but dolls aren't exactly high on the holy crap, I'm gonna die scale. Josh clicked on another image. This one was worse. A clearing in the woods completely littered with dolls, all of them facing the same direction, toward the photographer. The poster says people go missing there, Josh said. A hiker vanished last year. Before that, a couple left their car on a back road and never came back. All their gear was found near the dolls, untouched. Dave snorted. So what, bears, psycho hillbillies, maybe a really aggressive doll collector? Josh ignored him and kept reading. Sometimes at night you can hear them whispering, and if you listen too long, they ask you to come play. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Dave clapped his hands together. Well, sounds like we have our next case. Josh hesitated. Despite their channel, Beyond the Veil Investigations, being built on chasing the supernatural, there was something different about this one. But Dave was already grinning, pulling up a map of the Appalachian Range. Think about it, man, Dave said. If these dolls really do move, that's viral content, maybe even 1 million views. Josh exhaled sharply. He had a bad feeling about this, but still. Fine, he muttered, let's go find some dolls. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The road to the forest was barely a road at all, just a dirt path snaking through dense looming trees. Josh and Dave bumped along in their old SUV, the silence between them stretching as the signal bars on their phones disappeared one by one. No service, Josh muttered. Dave smirked. Perfect. Nothing like complete isolation to ramp up the horror factor. They arrived at the trailhead around midday. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp leaves and rotting wood. The forest was silent, no birds, no rustling, just the faint buzz of insects like white noise in the background of something unnatural. Then they saw the first doll. It sat at the base of an oak tree, half buried in the dirt. Time had not been kind to it. Its once pink dress was stained brown, its plastic limbs weathered and cracked. But the worst part was its face. Its eyes were missing, not just fallen out, gouged. 2 deep, uneven holes stared up at them. Okay, Dave said, stepping closer. That's unsettling. Josh crouched beside it, his fingers brushing the dirt. Someone did this. Dave scanned the trees. Yeah, but who and why? Then, as if the forest had been waiting for them to notice, the dolls started appearing everywhere, hanging from low branches by frayed strings, slumped against roots, peeking from behind logs. Some were missing limbs, others had crude symbols carved into their plastic skin. They walked deeper, the dolls growing in numbers, their eyeless faces turned toward the path as if watching them. Josh felt his stomach twist. This is wrong. Dave, ever the optimist, lifted his camera. This is content. That was when Josh saw it. A doll propped against a mossy rock, smaller than the others. Faded blue overalls, a chipped porcelain face. Something was scratched into its chest. His breath caught. It was his initials, JW. Josh staggered back. "Dave." His voice was thin, wavering. "Look." Dave stepped forward and his smile died, because beneath Josh's initials, DS was carved right beside it. Their initials on a doll, waiting for them. A branch snapped somewhere behind them. Josh turned, heart hammering. The forest was watching, and something was out there. By the time they set up camp, the sun was bleeding out behind the trees, casting long skeletal shadows across the forest floor. The dolls were still there, unmoving, but they felt different in the dark, less like forgotten toys and more like something waiting. Josh couldn't stop staring at the one with their initials carved into its chest. He had shoved it deep in his backpack, but he swore he could still feel it watching. Dave, oblivious, was in full-on filmmaker mode, adjusting the camera settings. "Dude, imagine if we actually catch one of these things moving on film. Instant million views." Josh rubbed his arms, suddenly cold. "Yeah, great." Night settled in fast, smothering the woods in thick darkness. They sat by the fire, reviewing footage, eating protein bars. It should have been a normal night, but then the giggling started. It was faint at first, distant, like a child's laughter carried on the wind. Josh stiffened. "Did you hear that?" Dave frowned. "Yeah, probably just rustling." Josh grabbed his flashlight and swung it toward the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing, just trees. Then the fire flickered, and the dolls were standing up. Josh's stomach dropped. The ones that had been slumped against roots, hanging from trees, or half buried in the dirt, were now standing upright, forming a loose semicircle around their camp. Their tiny, eyeless faces were all turned toward them. "Dave," Josh whispered. Dave had gone pale. His hands trembled as he raised the camera. "Tell me you're seeing this." The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows across the dolls. They were motionless, but something about them felt wrong, like they were waiting for the right moment. Then, in perfect unison, the dolls tilted their heads. A small voice, soft, childlike, just behind them, whispered, "Come play." Josh and Dave ran. They crashed through the underbrush, flashlight beams bouncing wildly. The trees felt endless, stretching higher, pressing in on them. Behind them, the giggling grew louder. Then Josh tripped over something soft. He scrambled to his knees, shoving his light toward the ground, and his blood ran cold. It was a backpack, old and torn, and beside it was a shirt with dried bloodstains. This wasn't just a legend. People had died here, and if they didn't get out, they'd be next. Josh's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he scrambled away from the blood-stained shirt. His mind screamed at him to rationalize it. Maybe it was just old, maybe it belonged to a hunter, maybe... No. He knew better. Someone had died here. Behind them, the giggling twisted into something else, something neither of them wanted to name. The dolls hadn't followed them, at least not that they could see, but the sound did. It wove through the trees, too close, too many voices, too wrong. Dave grabbed Josh's arm. "We need to move, now!" They sprinted deeper into the woods, dodging low-hanging branches, their flashlight beams flickering wildly. The forest felt endless, stretching in all directions like a living thing intent on keeping them inside. Then Josh saw something ahead, a break in the trees, an open space. "Clearing, go!" he shouted. They burst through the underbrush, expecting open ground. Instead, they found more dolls, hundreds of them. The clearing was littered with them, scattered across the grass, slumped against tree stumps, hanging from makeshift nooses. Their tiny hands reached out toward the sky. Dave doubled over, hands on his knees. What the actual hell? Josh swept his light over the scene, his pulse a hammer against his ribs. These dolls were different. Their plastic faces were smoother, more realistic. Their limbs... Josh swallowed hard. Some of them weren't plastic. Some of them looked like leather. Human leather. His stomach lurched. Then his beam landed on something worse. A partially formed doll lay propped against a log, its body unfinished, skin too soft, too fresh, like it had been peeled from something that hadn't been dead long enough. Its mouth was frozen in an agonized, almost pleading expression. Josh recoiled. Oh God. Dave was staring at something else. Another doll, still in the process of being made. Its hair was human, dark, matted, real. Josh's mind raced. The missing hikers, the vanished campers, they hadn't disappeared. They had been turned into dolls. A high-pitched giggle sliced through the silence. Then, tiny footsteps in the leaves. Josh's flashlight flickered out. Darkness swallowed them whole. The flashlight died, plunging them into pitch blackness. Josh's breath hitched. He slapped the side of the flashlight, his fingers numb with panic. Nothing. Just the sound of leaves shifting, like tiny hands skittering closer. Dave whispered, "Josh, they're moving." The moon broke through the canopy for just a second, silver light spilling over the clearing, and that was when Josh saw it. The dolls were standing up, all of them, hundreds of them. The ones on the ground, the ones leaning against trees, the ones hanging from branches. They were standing now, their tiny fingerless hands outstretched. And they weren't where they had been before. They were closer. Dave fumbled with his camera, hand shaking so badly the lens clicked against his rings. "We need proof." Josh grabbed him. "Screw proof. We need to get the hell out of here." Then the giggling stopped. Complete suffocating silence. And that was worse. Josh turned in a slow, shaky circle. The dolls weren't just standing, they were facing him. Something rustled behind them, a small, padded footstep. Josh turned and froze. There, half hidden behind a gnarled tree, was a figure. At first it looked like a child, small, slight, dressed in something ragged and gray. But as the moonlight shifted, so did the figure. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then Josh realized it wasn't standing, it was floating. He took a step back, his boot crunched on brittle leaves. The figure twitched, and then it moved. Not walked, glided, it didn't have feet. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows, its shape shifting like a flickering candle. Then it spoke, not a whisper, not a giggle. A voice, small, sad, and cold as winter air. "They made me a monster." Josh's knees locked. His throat felt stuffed with cotton. "What?" The figure lifted a hand, small skeletal fingers curling inward. "They burned me, and now I burn them." Josh barely had time to process that before the dolls lunged. Josh and Dave ran through the trees, lungs burning, branches whipping against their arms and faces. The flashlight in Josh's hand flickered erratically, barely keeping the shifting shapes in the darkness at bay. Behind them, the laughter was gone. Now there was only silence, and that was somehow worse. Then up ahead, a structure. "Dave!" Josh gasped, pointing. "There!" They stumbled toward it, an old abandoned research cabin, its wooden frame rotting, half consumed by moss. A rusted metal sign leaned against the porch, barely legible in the dark. Property of the Appalachian Research Initiative. Josh didn't care who had built it. It was shelter. He shoved open the warped door, dragging Dave inside before slamming it shut. The moment the latch clicked, the air in the cabin changed. Colder, heavier. Josh braced his hands against his knees, sucking in sharp, ragged breaths. Dave leaned against the wall, gulping air. The cabin stank of mildew and something else, something dead. Josh swept his flashlight across the room. Inside, dust-covered shelves sagged under the weight of old books and journals, their spines warped from moisture. A desk sat against the far wall, its surface covered in yellowed papers and brittle, rotting notebooks. Dave picked up a large, leather-bound journal, the edges dark with age. "This guy was documenting something," he murmured, flipping it open. The handwriting was frantic, nearly illegible in places. Josh peered over his shoulder as Dave read aloud. "The legends are true. The girl exists. The dolls are hers, but they are not toys. They are the souls of those she has claimed." Josh shivered. Dave turned the page, his voice quieter. "She was never a witch. They burned her anyway. She cursed this place before the fire took her. She said her children would always be with her." Josh's fingers clenched. Children, not actual children, the dolls. "They're not just objects," Josh whispered. "They're people." Dave's hands trembled. He flipped another page. I have seen what happens to those who stay too long. The dolls watch, then they whisper, then they take you. Josh's stomach lurched. A creak sounded outside the cabin. Josh turned, flashlight shaking. The window was fogging over like something was breathing against the glass. Then, just outside, a tiny silhouette appeared. The girl, watching, waiting. Then, she took a step forward. Josh's grip on the flashlight tightened as the girl moved closer. Her small, shadowed form hovered just beyond the fogged-up window, her head slightly tilted, like she was listening. The air inside the cabin grew thick, suffocating, like it had been pulled from their lungs. Dave took an unsteady step back, the journal still clutched in his hands. Josh tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He forced the words out. What do you want?" For a long moment, the girl didn't move. Then, slowly, she lifted a hand and pressed her burned skeletal fingers against the glass. The fog beneath them turned black, spreading like ink. Dave swallowed hard. "Josh, we need to—" Then the door creaked open on its own. A gust of frigid air swept through the cabin, carrying the scent of charred wood and something ancient, something wrong. The flashlight flickered. Then, a whisper. Not the childish giggling from before. This was one voice, small and hollow, drifting through the freezing air. "They burned me." Josh and Dave stiffened. The girl stepped inside. Her feet didn't touch the floor. She floated forward, the edges of her blackened dress frayed and shifting like smoke. Josh's chest felt like it was locking up. He wanted to run, to look away, but her hollow gaze pinned him in place. Dave trembled beside him. You weren't a witch," he stammered. "They killed you for nothing." The girl's head tilted sharply, her fingers twitching. Then the darkness in the room thickened, pressing against them like unseen hands. Josh's thoughts raced. The journal had said she didn't want revenge. She wanted the truth. He forced his voice to stay steady. "We'll tell your story," he said. "We'll tell the world what happened to you." The girl's gaze snapped to him. The cabin groaned around them, the shadows pulsing like a heartbeat. For a long moment, she just stared, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, the darkness retreated. The air lightened. The temperature rose by a fraction. Her lips parted. "Tell them." Then she was gone. The cabin door slammed shut, and outside, the dolls collapsed, their tiny bodies falling lifeless to the ground. Josh's breath shuddered out of him. Dave looked at him, pale and shaken. "I think she's letting us go." Josh didn't wait to find out. "Then let's get the hell out of here." The cabin was silent, the girl gone. Josh didn't waste a second. He grabbed Dave's arm and yanked him toward the door. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They stumbled onto the porch, the cold air hitting them like a wall. The dolls were gone. The forest floor, once littered with their twisted, eyeless forms, was now empty. The ones hanging from trees, the ones slumped against logs, the ones that had surrounded their tent the night before, vanished. Dave let out a shuddering breath. Jesus. Josh turned in a slow circle, the weight in his chest finally easing. The forest still felt old, still felt wrong, but the oppressive, choking presence had lifted. They were free. Dave ran a trembling hand through his hair. "You think she's really gone?" Josh exhaled sharply, glancing back at the cabin. Not gone, just at peace. And for the first time since arriving, the woods felt like just a forest. But then, Josh saw it. One doll, left in the center of the clearing. It sat upright, its tiny hands resting in its lap, its stitched mouth curved in a slight, eerie smile. Unlike the others, it had eyes, two small, polished black stones. They were watching, and carved into its chest. JW, DS. Josh's stomach dropped. Dave saw it, too. Nope, not taking that thing with us. Josh's hands were clammy, his heart hammering against his ribs. "It's not meant for us," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Dave frowned. "Then why the hell is it here?" Josh swallowed hard. "It's a warning." A gust of wind rustled the trees. The whispering was gone, but the silence that replaced it felt just as heavy. Josh hesitated, then slowly crouched and picked up the doll. Its fabric was cold, its carved letters rough beneath his fingertips. Dave groaned. "You're actually taking it?" Josh didn't answer. He didn't want to, but he had a feeling they didn't have a choice. Some stories don't end just because you walk away. They turned and made their way back toward the trailhead, their footsteps loud in the dead quiet. And the whole time Josh could feel the weight of the doll in his hands, like something still wasn't finished. The drive back was silent. Josh gripped the steering wheel like a lifeline, his eyes locked on the darkened road. Dave sat beside him, slumped against the window, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Neither of them spoke about the doll sitting in the back seat. Josh could feel it there, even without looking. The forest had let them go, but something about that final doll felt unfinished, like an open door they hadn't quite closed. They reached their apartment just before dawn. The world felt normal again, cars on the streets, lights in windows, the distant hum of life moving forward. But the feeling of being watched never faded. Josh carried the doll inside, setting it down carefully on the coffee table. It didn't move, didn't whisper, but it didn't need to. Dave stared at it from the kitchen. So, what now? Josh ran a hand down his face. He felt drained, like something inside him had been taken and not fully returned. "We keep our promise," Dave exhaled slowly. "You think that'll be enough?" Josh didn't answer. He didn't know. They spent the next few days piecing together the footage, editing the most disturbing moments, cutting together their final video. It was their most important upload yet. A warning, a story. The truth. They told everything, the dolls, the missing hikers, the girl who was never a witch, the curse that bound her to that place. They didn't embellish, they didn't need to. They posted it at midnight, and by morning it was everywhere. The comments poured in, skeptics, believers, people claiming to have heard the same legend but never dared to go looking. Some wanted to see the forest for themselves. Josh hoped they wouldn't. Then the emails started. People sending pictures of dolls that had started appearing in places they shouldn't be. One photo made Josh's blood run cold. A doll on a doorstep somewhere in another state. A tiny, hand-stitched smile. 2 black stone eyes, and carved into its chest, JW, DS. Josh pushed away from his desk, his chair scraping against the floor. Behind him, Dave whispered, "Josh." Josh turned. The doll, the one they had brought back, the one that had been sitting on the coffee table all night, was gone. Outside something rustled, and for the first time since leaving the forest, they heard it again. A small voice. "Come play." It all started with a post I stumbled upon in a Reddit thread about the dark web. I had always been fascinated by the stories people shared, the forbidden corners of the internet they explored. Most of it seemed like urban legends, but something about this particular post caught my attention. Looking for the ultimate horror experience? Try Haunted VR, the game that blurs the lines between reality and fiction. Download at your own risk. The post was accompanied by a link, one that led me to a shady-looking website. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I had downloaded the game. It came with a warning. This game is not for the faint of heart. Play at your own risk. I booted up my VR headset, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. The title screen flickered to life with an eerie animation of a haunted house. The graphics were incredibly realistic, more so than any VR game I had played before. As I selected Start Game, I found myself standing in front of a decrepit mansion, its windows boarded up and the front door slightly ajar. The game began with a voiceover. "Welcome to Haunted VR. Your goal is simple. Survive the night and find the way out. But be warned, the ghosts in this house are not just part of the game." I chuckled nervously, thinking it was just a clever way to enhance the atmosphere. Little did I know, those words were a sinister premonition. As I entered the house, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I turned around, but the door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. The sound design was impeccable. I could hear the floorboards creak beneath my feet, the distant wailing of the wind and faint whispers that sent chills down my spine. The first room I entered was a parlor filled with antique furniture covered in dust. A grand piano stood in the corner, its keys yellowed and cracked. I reached out to touch it, and to my shock, it played a haunting melody by itself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I pressed on, reminding myself it was just a game. Exploring further, I found a diary on a dusty old table. The entries detailed the life of a family who once lived in the house. According to the diary, they had been tormented by a malevolent spirit, leading to their untimely deaths. The last entry was particularly disturbing. The ghosts are real. They won't let us leave. They have trapped our souls here forever. My heart pounded in my chest as I continued reading. Could this just be part of the game's backstory? It felt too real. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find an exit or at least some clues to progress in the game. As I moved from room to room, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and ghostly apparitions would appear and vanish in the blink of an eye. I encountered puzzles that required me to piece together the tragic history of the house. Each solved puzzle brought me closer to the truth, but also deeper into the nightmare. Then something happened that made me question everything. I reached a room that was a perfect replica of my own bedroom, my real bedroom. Every detail was accurate, down to the posters on the walls and the books on my nightstand. A sense of dread washed over me. How could this be possible? As I stood there stunned, I heard a whisper right next to my ear. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but no one was there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. It had to be a coincidence, a random generation of game assets that just happened to resemble my room. Suddenly the screen flickered, and I found myself back in the parlor, but this time I wasn't alone. A ghostly figure stood in the corner, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. "You're one of us now," it whispered, and I felt a cold chill spread through my body. Panicking, I tried to exit the game, but the option was grayed out. I was trapped. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a game. My consciousness was somehow ensnared within this digital nightmare. Desperation set in as I frantically searched for a way out. The ghosts became more aggressive, their presence suffocating. They whispered my name, taunted me with fragments of my own memories. It was as if they were feeding off my fear. Hours felt like days, and I began to lose my grip on reality. Was I still in my room, playing a game, or was this now my reality? The lines blurred, and I started to doubt my own sanity. Finally, I found a clue, a cryptic message scratched into the wall of the attic. "Find the mirror. The mirror is the key." With renewed determination, I set out to locate this mirror, hoping it would be my ticket out of this hellish place. But the house had other plans. It twisted and shifted, turning into a labyrinth of endless hallways and dead ends. The ghosts grew bolder, their attacks more direct. I could feel their icy touch, hear their mournful cries. As I stumbled through the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this struggle. The ghosts seemed familiar, as if they were past players who had also been trapped. Their despair mirrored my own, a reminder of what awaited me if I failed to escape. I finally found the mirror in a hidden chamber, its surface cracked and tarnished. As I approached, the reflection that stared back at me wasn't my own. It was a gaunt, hollow-eyed version of myself, a grim preview of what I was becoming. Gathering my courage, I reached out and touched the mirror. A blinding light enveloped me, and I felt a wrenching sensation as if I were being pulled apart. The world around me dissolved, and I was plunged into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my room, the VR headset on the floor beside me. I ripped it off, gasping for air. I was free, or so I thought. the relief was short-lived. As I glanced at my reflection in the mirror, I saw them. The ghosts standing behind me, their eyes filled with sorrow and malice. And I realized the horrifying truth. I had brought them back with me. After that horrifying night, I avoided my VR headset like the plague. It sat untouched on my desk, a constant reminder of the ordeal I had barely escaped. Or at least I thought I had escaped. But the ghosts I had encountered in the game seemed to have followed me back into the real world. At first, it was just a feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The shadows in my room seemed darker, more sinister, and the temperature would drop inexplicably, sending chills down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a lingering effect of the intense VR experience. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. One evening, about a week after playing the game, I decided to take a break from everything and clear my mind. I went out for a walk around my neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would help me shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me. As I strolled through the familiar streets, I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything was. It was almost unnaturally silent, as if the world was holding its breath. I turned a corner and nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw a figure standing under a street lamp. It was just an old man waiting for the bus, but for a split second, he had looked exactly like one of the ghosts from the game. My heart pounded in my chest as I hurried past, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. When I returned home, I felt slightly better, but that feeling of unease never fully left me. As I settled in for the night, I noticed something odd. The lights in my apartment began to flicker. I checked the bulbs, but they seemed fine. A sudden, chilling draft swept through the room, despite all the windows being closed. Then, I heard it. A faint whisper, like someone calling my name. "John." I froze, my blood running cold. It was the same whisper I had heard in the game. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was the game somehow still affecting me? Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to confront my fears head-on. I retrieved the VR headset from my desk, my hands trembling. I had to know if the game was truly responsible for the strange occurrences. Taking a deep breath, I put on the headset and powered it up. The title screen of Haunted VR flickered to life, and I hesitated for a moment before selecting Continue Game. I found myself back in the haunted house, standing in the parlor where I had first encountered the ghostly figure. This time, however, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The air felt thick with malevolence, and the shadows seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. "Welcome back," the voiceover intoned, sending a shiver down my spine. "You must find the mirror to escape, but be warned, the house does not want you to leave." I steeled myself and began exploring once more. The house had changed since my last visit, the layout more labyrinthine and confusing. The whispers were more frequent now, echoing through the hallways and taunting me with my own fears and doubts. As I ventured deeper into the house, I encountered more clues about the family who had lived there. Old photographs, tattered letters, and even recordings played back the tragic tale of their demise. It became clear that the spirits were not just malevolent. They were desperate for release. They were trapped just as I was. I reached a room I hadn't seen before, a nursery with faded wallpaper and broken toys strewn about. The sight was unsettling, but what caught my attention was a small, ornate box on the shelf. I opened it, revealing an old-fashioned key. Attached was a note. "The attic holds the answers." With renewed determination, I made my way to the attic, the journey fraught with spectral encounters and eerie phenomena. Doors slammed shut behind me, ghostly figures brushed past, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Finally, I reached the attic door and used the key to unlock it. The room was dark, filled with cobwebs and forgotten relics. In the center stood an old full-length mirror, its surface covered in grime. As I approached, I could feel the temperature drop, and the air became thick with an oppressive presence. I took a deep breath and wiped the grime from the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, but something was off. The figure in the mirror was slightly distorted, its eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. I realized with a sinking feeling that I wasn't just looking at my own reflection. I was looking at the ghostly presence that had been haunting me. Summoning all my courage, I reached out and touched the mirror. A blinding light enveloped me once again, and I felt a wrenching sensation as if I were being pulled apart. The world around me dissolved, and I was plunged into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my room, the VR headset on the floor beside me. I ripped it off, gasping for air. I was free, or so I thought. The relief was short-lived. As I glanced at my reflection in the mirror, I saw them, the ghosts standing behind me, their eyes filled with sorrow and malice. And I realized the horrifying truth. I had brought them back with me. After the second encounter with the VR game, I knew I was in serious trouble. The ghosts from the game had followed me into the real world, and they weren't just haunting my apartment. They were haunting my mind. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of light reminded me that they were always there, watching and waiting. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I decided to confide in my best friend, Mark. He was a tech enthusiast and might understand the weird connection between the game and the real world. I invited him over, making sure to downplay my fears so he wouldn't think I was completely losing it. When Mark arrived, I tried to explain everything as rationally as I could. He listened patiently, though his eyebrows raised higher with every detail I shared. "Dude, are you sure you didn't just have a really intense nightmare?" he asked, skepticism clear in his voice. "I know how it sounds, but this is real," I insisted. "I've seen them, Mark. They're in my apartment. They're in my head." Mark sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "All right, let's check out this game. Maybe there's something in the code that can explain what's happening." We set up the VR headset, and I showed him the game. As he navigated through the haunted house, I could see his initial doubt giving way to genuine concern. The atmosphere, the whispers, the ghostly figures, it was all too real, even for him. "This is unsettling," Mark admitted as he took off the headset. "But I still don't understand how it's affecting you outside of the game." "I don't either," I said, frustration and fear mixing in my voice. "But there has to be a way to stop it. Maybe if we find out more about the developers or the origins of the game, we can figure something out." Mark agreed to help me investigate. We spent the next few days digging through forums, contacting other players, and even venturing back into the dark web. What we discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. Haunted VR was created by a small, anonymous group known as the Shadow Collective. Rumors suggested they were not just game developers but also dabblers in the occult, using ancient rituals to infuse their games with real supernatural entities. The goal was to create the most immersive horror experience ever, but they had gone too far, losing control over the spirits they had summoned. Our research also led us to a former member of the Shadow Collective who had posted anonymously on a forum years ago. He claimed that the only way to sever the connection between the game and the real world was to destroy the original source code, which was hidden in a secret location within the game itself. Determined to end this nightmare, I decided to go back into the game one last time. Mark agreed to monitor everything from the outside, ready to pull me out if things went wrong. With a sense of dread and resolve, I donned the VR headset again and re-entered the haunted house. This time I knew my goal: find the source code and destroy it. The house seemed even more hostile than before, as if it knew I was trying to break free. The ghosts were more aggressive, their whispers louder and more menacing. They taunted me with my deepest fears, trying to break my will. I navigated through the twisted hallways, solving puzzles and avoiding spectral attacks. The house shifted and changed, making it difficult to find my way. But I pressed on, driven by the hope that I could end this once and for all. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a hidden chamber deep within the house. In the center of the room was an old computer, its screen glowing with a sinister light. As I approached, I could feel the presence of the ghosts closing in, their anger palpable. I quickly accessed the computer, navigating through layers of encrypted files until I found the source code. My hands trembled as I prepared to delete it, knowing that this was my only chance to free myself from the game's grasp. Just as I was about to hit the delete key, the screen flickered, and a message appeared. "Are you sure you want to destroy the source? This action cannot be undone." I hesitated for a moment, but then the faces of the ghosts flashed before my eyes, reminding me of the torment they had caused. With a deep breath, I confirmed the deletion. The screen went black, and a deafening silence filled the air. Suddenly, the house began to shake, and the ghosts wailed in agony. I felt a powerful force pulling me away from the computer, tearing at my consciousness. The world around me dissolved into chaos, and I was plunged into darkness once more. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment, the VR headset lying on the floor. Mark was beside me, looking worried. "Did it work?" he asked, helping me to my feet. I glanced around, expecting to see the ghosts, but there was nothing. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. I let out a shaky breath and nodded. "I think so. They're gone." Mark clapped me on the back, relief evident in his eyes. "Good job, man. Let's hope it stays that way." But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The whispers had stopped, and the shadows no longer moved on their own. But I couldn't forget the final message on the screen. This action cannot be undone. Had I truly destroyed the connection, or had I just unleashed something even worse? Only time would tell. For a few weeks, life returned to some semblance of normalcy. The ghosts were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere that had enveloped my apartment lifted. I resumed my daily routine, cautiously optimistic that the nightmare was over. Mark and I kept in touch, sharing a silent agreement never to mention haunted VR again. But as time went on, subtle signs began to suggest otherwise. It started with my dreams. They were vivid, filled with the haunted house and the ghosts I thought I had banished. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the whispers echoing in my mind. This action cannot be undone. I tried to dismiss the dreams as residual fear, a natural consequence of the trauma I had experienced. But it wasn't just the dreams. Strange things began happening around my apartment. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and I would hear faint, almost imperceptible whispers late at night. It was as if the ghosts were trying to claw their way back into my reality. One evening, as I was doing laundry, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the back of my closet door, scratched into the wood, were the words, "We are still here." The handwriting was jagged and desperate, identical to the messages I had seen in the game. I called Mark, my voice trembling as I described what I had found. He came over immediately, his concern mirroring my own. Together, we searched the apartment, looking for any other signs of the supernatural. We found nothing else, but the unease remained. "We need to find out more about the Shadow Collective," Mark said, his tone determined. "There has to be a way to make this stop for good." We dove back into our research, scouring the internet for any information about the mysterious group behind haunted VR. Our efforts led us to a series of obscure forums and encrypted chat rooms where other victims shared their experiences. We learned that we weren't alone. Others had played the game and were now facing similar hauntings. One name kept coming up, Dr. Evelyn Ward. She was a parapsychologist who had studied the intersection of technology and the paranormal. According to the forums, Dr. Ward had been researching the Shadow Collective for years and might have the answers we were looking for. It took some effort, but we managed to track down Dr. Ward's contact information. I reached out to her, explaining our situation and pleading for her help. To my relief, she agreed to meet with us. Dr. Ward's office was in an old ivy-covered building on the outskirts of town. The walls were lined with books on the occult, paranormal phenomena, and advanced technology. She greeted us warmly, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. "I've been following the Shadow Collective for a long time," she said, motioning for us to sit. "Their work is dangerous, blending dark rituals with advanced coding to create what they call haunted experiences. But it seems they've lost control over what they've summoned." We told her everything, from downloading the game to the lingering hauntings. She listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "The spirits you encountered are bound to the game's code," Dr. Ward explained. "When you deleted the source code, you disrupted their connection to the digital realm. But it also severed the barrier keeping them confined. Now, they're trapped between worlds." "So how do we stop them?" Mark asked, his frustration evident. Dr. Ward sighed. "It won't be easy, but there might be a way. We need to perform a ritual to banish the spirits back to where they came from. However, it must be done within the game's environment. You'll have to re-enter Haunted VR." My heart sank. The thought of going back into that cursed game filled me with dread, but I knew it was the only option. Dr. Ward gave us detailed instructions for the ritual and handed me a small, ornate amulet. "This will protect you from the spirits while you're in the game. Do not take it off, no matter what." That night, Mark and I set up the VR equipment once more. I put on the headset, clutching the amulet tightly. As the game booted up, I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. The haunted house appeared before me, more menacing than ever. Following Dr. Ward's instructions, I made my way to the attic, where the ritual was to be performed. The journey was fraught with spectral encounters and chilling whispers, but the amulet seemed to ward off the worst of the attacks. Finally, I reached the attic, the mirror still standing in the center. I placed the amulet on the mirror's surface and began reciting the incantation Dr. Ward had provided. The air grew colder, and the ghosts materialized around me, their faces twisted with anger and sorrow. They screamed and reached out, but an invisible barrier kept them at bay. As I continued the ritual, the mirror began to glow, and the ghosts were pulled towards it, their forms dissolving into the light. The house shook violently, and a deafening roar filled my ears. I pressed on, determined to see it through. With a final desperate cry, the last of the spirits was drawn into the mirror, and the light faded. The house fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. I removed the amulet and touched the mirror, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. When I removed the VR headset, I found Mark and Dr. Ward waiting anxiously. "Did it work?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, a smile spreading across my face. "It's over. They're gone." Dr. Ward looked relieved. "You've done well. The spirits are finally at rest." Life slowly returned to normal after that. The whispers stopped, and the shadows in my apartment no longer seemed threatening. I kept the VR headset as a reminder of the ordeal, but I never played Haunted VR again. The experience had taught me a valuable lesson about the dangers of meddling with forces beyond our understanding. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispers, reminding me that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy after the ritual. The haunting presence that had plagued me seemed to have dissipated, and I could finally breathe easily in my own home. Mark and I were both relieved, but a part of me couldn't shake the lingering unease. Dr. Ward's warning about the dangers of meddling with forces beyond our understanding echoed in my mind. Weeks turned into months, and I settled back into my routine. My dreams were no longer filled with the haunted house or the spectral figures that had tormented me. The whispers had ceased, and the shadows behaved like normal shadows should. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace. One day, while cleaning my apartment, I stumbled upon the VR headset. I had tucked it away in a drawer, hoping to forget about Haunted VR entirely. But now, looking at it, curiosity gnawed at me. What if there were still answers to be found? What if the final piece of the puzzle was still out there? I reached out to Dr. Ward and Mark, proposing one last investigation. They were hesitant, but agreed to help. We decided to delve deeper into the Shadow Collective and their other projects, hoping to find any lingering connections that might explain my ongoing unease. Our research led us to a series of obscure blogs and forums where former members of the Shadow Collective had posted. One name stood out: Adrian Blake, the alleged mastermind behind the collective. Blake had vanished years ago, but rumors suggested he was still alive, hiding somewhere remote. After weeks of digging, we found a lead. An old colleague of Blake's, now living in seclusion, had mentioned him in an interview. With Mark and Dr. Ward's encouragement, I reached out to this colleague, hoping for a response. Surprisingly, I received a reply inviting us to meet at a secluded cabin in the woods. The journey to the cabin was tense. Mark, Dr. Ward, and I drove in silence, each lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, we were greeted by an elderly man with piercing blue eyes and an air of quiet wisdom. He introduced himself as Thomas Crane. Adrian was a brilliant but troubled man, Crane began as we settled into the cabin's cozy living room. He believed he could merge technology and the supernatural, creating experiences that transcended reality. But he underestimated the forces he was dealing with. We listened intently as Crane recounted Blake's experiments and the creation of Haunted VR. According to Crane, the game wasn't just a product of coding and programming. It was infused with ancient rituals and bound spirits, all controlled by a central artifact known as the Shadow Core. The Shadow Core is the heart of the collective's power, Crane explained. It's what allowed them to manipulate the supernatural within their games. If you truly want to end this, you must find and destroy it. Armed with this new knowledge, we set out to locate the Shadow Core. Crane provided us with a map and instructions, warning us that the journey would be perilous. The Shadow Core was hidden in an abandoned mansion deep in the woods, the very place where Blake had conducted his final, disastrous experiment. The mansion was decrepit and overgrown with ivy, its windows shattered and its doors barely hanging on their hinges. As we entered, the air grew heavy with a familiar, oppressive presence. The ghosts were back, but this time I felt a strange sense of resolve. I knew what had to be done. We navigated through the mansion, following Crane's instructions. The halls were filled with the echoes of past tragedies, and ghostly figures watched us from the shadows. But the amulet Dr. Ward had given me provided protection, its warm glow warding off the spirits. Finally, we reached the basement, where the Shadow Core was kept. It was a small, ornate box, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. As I approached, the ghosts became more agitated, their whispers turning into anguished cries. I hesitated, but Mark and Dr. Ward encouraged me to press on. With trembling hands, I opened the box and saw the Shadow Core, a smooth obsidian stone inscribed with ancient runes. The moment I touched it, a surge of energy coursed through me, and the ghosts screamed in unison. Following Crane's instructions, I performed the ritual to destroy the Shadow Core. The stone glowed brighter and brighter until it shattered into 1,000 pieces, releasing a blinding light that filled the room. The ghosts wailed one last time before dissolving into nothingness, their tormented souls finally at peace. As the light faded, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and a calm silence settled over the mansion. We had done it. The connection to the supernatural had been severed, and the spirits were free. We left the mansion, the weight of the ordeal slowly lifting from our shoulders. Dr. Ward smiled, a look of relief on her face. "You did it. You ended their torment." Mark clapped me on the back. "Looks like we can finally put this behind us." I nodded, feeling a sense of closure. The journey had been long and harrowing, but we had faced the darkness and come out the other side. The experience had changed me, but it had also given me a new appreciation for the world and the unseen forces that lurk within it. Back in my apartment, I put away the VR headset for good. The haunted game was just a memory now, a cautionary tale of what happens when we delve too deeply into the unknown. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a sense of peace knowing that the ghosts were finally at rest. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispers, a reminder of the journey we took and the darkness we faced. And though the doors to that world are closed, I know that some mysteries are best left unexplored, their secrets hidden in the shadows of our minds. I've always had a fascination with conspiracy theories and the dark corners of the internet. It was during one of my late-night browsing sessions that I stumbled upon something that would change my life forever, a dark web ebook titled Surviving the Alien Apocalypse. The title alone was enough to pique my interest, and without much thought, I downloaded it. The ebook was a comprehensive guide filled with detailed strategies and locations of supposed safe havens around the world. What struck me was the level of detail: maps, coordinates, survival tips, even the types of aliens we might encounter. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It felt disturbingly real, but at the same time I couldn't shake off the feeling that it was just another elaborate hoax. As I delved deeper into the guide, I found myself both horrified and intrigued. The author claimed to have insider knowledge, warning readers about imminent alien invasions, government cover-ups, and global conspiracies. According to the guide, the invasion had already begun, but the signs were subtle and easy to miss. I dismissed it as fiction at first, but the more I read, the more uneasy I became. The first section of the guide was about recognizing the signs of the apocalypse. It listed several warning signs: sudden disappearances of people, strange lights in the sky, unexplained power outages, and increased UFO sightings. It all seemed far-fetched until I started noticing these signs in my own town. It began with the disappearances. A few people from my neighborhood had gone missing over the past couple of weeks. I didn't think much of it initially. People move away or sometimes just vanish for personal reasons. But the guide had mentioned this specifically, and it gave me chills. Then there were the lights. At night, I noticed strange pulsating lights in the sky, almost like a strobe effect, but with no discernible source. They were there one moment, gone the next. I couldn't explain it, and neither could anyone else. My friends brushed it off as drones or weather phenomena, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. The power outages were the tipping point. They started happening sporadically, plunging our entire neighborhood into darkness without warning. These weren't your average blackouts. They felt deliberate, almost like tests. The guide had warned about these too, claiming they were preludes to larger events. I began to feel paranoid, constantly on edge. My friends and family noticed my change in behavior, but I couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe me if I said I was preparing for an alien apocalypse based on a book I found on the dark web? Instead, I started quietly preparing, following the guide's instructions to the letter. I stocked up on non-perishable food, water, medical supplies, and anything else I might need to survive. I mapped out the locations of the safe havens mentioned in the guide, making mental notes of the nearest ones. I even started learning basic survival skills, just in case I had to go off-grid. The guide also mentioned forming alliances, as survival alone would be nearly impossible. Trust was essential, but it also warned to be cautious of who you trusted. Aliens, it claimed, had the ability to mimic human appearance and behavior. This was the most disturbing part for me. How could I know who was real and who wasn't? One night, as I was lying in bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from an unknown sender, but the message was clear. "They're here. Be ready." My heart raced as I stared at the screen. Who had sent this? Was it someone from the guide? Or was it a warning from someone who knew the truth? I decided to investigate further, keeping my preparations secret. Every day, I saw more signs that aligned with the guide's predictions. People around me seemed oblivious, going about their daily lives, unaware of the looming threat. I felt a growing sense of responsibility to protect myself and those I cared about, but I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. As the days passed, the signs became more frequent and more obvious. The lights in the sky were no longer just flashes. They became sustained beams of light. almost like searchlights scanning the ground. The power outages grew longer, and the disappearances more frequent. It was happening just like the guide had said. One evening, as I was reviewing my preparations, there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my heart leaped into my throat. I peered through the peephole and saw a man standing there looking nervous. He introduced himself as John, claiming to have read the same guide and looking for others who were preparing. I hesitated, remembering the guide's warning about trust. But something about his demeanor seemed genuine, and I decided to let him in. We talked for hours, sharing our experiences and fears. John had noticed the same signs and was just as scared as I was. It was a relief to finally have someone to talk to, someone who understood. As the night wore on, we made a pact to stick together and help each other survive. It felt good to have an ally, but the fear of the unknown still loomed large. The guide had been accurate so far, but there was no guarantee it would keep us safe. We had to be vigilant, ready for anything. The next morning, as I looked out my window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A group of people, dressed in dark uniforms, were patrolling the streets. They moved with a purpose, scanning the area with devices I couldn't identify. It was as if they were searching for something, or someone. John and I exchanged a worried glance. The guide had mentioned this too. Government agents working with the aliens, hunting down those who knew the truth. We had to stay hidden, avoid drawing attention to ourselves. Our survival depended on it. As the days turned into weeks, the signs of the apocalypse grew more pronounced. The lights in the sky became a nightly occurrence, the power outages longer and more widespread. People continued to disappear, and the sense of fear and unease grew stronger. John and I stuck to our plan, following the guide's instructions and staying out of sight. But deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The guide had been eerily accurate so far, but there were still so many unknowns. Would we find the safe havens in time? Would we be able to trust the people we met along the way? And most importantly, would we survive the alien apocalypse? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. We were in for the fight of our lives, and we had to be ready for whatever came next. The morning after we saw the patrolling agents, John and I decided we needed to make our first move. The guide had detailed specific actions to take once the signs became undeniable, and we were well past that point. It was time to leave our homes and head for the first safe haven listed, a remote cabin in the mountains about a day's drive away. We packed our supplies meticulously. Every item had its place: food, water, medical kits, clothing, and survival gear. The guide emphasized the importance of being mobile and ready to leave at a moment's notice. We also packed tools and materials for basic repairs, knowing we might not have access to shops or services for a long time. Before we left, I decided to check in on my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She was an elderly woman who lived alone, and I didn't feel right leaving without warning her. When I knocked on her door, she greeted me with a warm smile, completely unaware of the growing danger. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to talk to you about something important," I began, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Have you noticed anything strange lately? Lights in the sky? Power outages?" She nodded, looking puzzled. "Yes, dear, I have. I thought it was just the weather or some electrical problem." I took a deep breath and explained as much as I could without sounding like a lunatic. I told her about the guide and the signs of the impending apocalypse. To my surprise, she listened intently, not dismissing my words as I feared she might. "You've always been a smart boy," she said finally. "If you think we need to leave, I trust you." Relieved, I helped her gather a few essentials. Mrs. Thompson didn't have much, so we packed light and made sure she had warm clothing and medication. As we left her house, John joined us and we made our way to my car. The drive to the cabin was tense. We took back roads to avoid the main highways, which the guide warned might be monitored. Every few miles we saw signs that confirmed our worst fears: military checkpoints, groups of people being escorted away, and more of those dark uniformed agents patrolling the area. "Do you think we'll make it?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to," I replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "There's no turning back now." As we neared the mountains, the scenery changed dramatically. The dense forests and winding roads offered a sense of seclusion, but also heightened our awareness. We were truly on our own out here, relying solely on the guide and each other. We finally arrived at the coordinates provided in the guide, and there it was, the cabin. It looked just as described, a small sturdy structure nestled among the trees, far from any signs of civilization. We approached cautiously, not knowing what or who might be inside. The cabin was empty, but it was clear someone had been there recently. There were supplies neatly stored away, and a map pinned to the wall with markings that matched those in the guide. It was a small comfort knowing we weren't the only ones who had found this place. We settled in, securing the windows and doors as best we could. The first night was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of the trees and the occasional call of a distant animal. Despite the tension, we managed to get some rest, knowing we needed to be alert for whatever came next. The next morning, we began to organize our supplies and plan our next steps. The guide suggested that staying in one place for too long was dangerous, as the aliens and their collaborators would eventually find us. It advised a nomadic approach, moving from one safe haven to the next. We spent the day practicing survival skills, starting fires, purifying water, and setting up traps for small game. Mrs. Thompson proved to be surprisingly adept, sharing stories of her younger days camping with her late husband. Her presence brought a sense of normalcy and warmth to our dire situation. As evening approached, we gathered around a small fire outside the cabin, discussing our plans. The guide mentioned another safe haven further north, a network of caves that could provide shelter and security. We decided to leave the next day, ensuring we stayed ahead of any potential threats. Just as we were about to head inside, we heard a noise, a faint rustling in the bushes nearby. We froze, exchanging worried glances. John gestured for us to stay quiet as he slowly moved towards the source of the sound. After a few tense moments, he called out, "It's okay, it's just a deer." We all let out a collective sigh of relief, but it served as a stark reminder of the constant danger we were in. Even the smallest sound could be a threat, and we couldn't afford to let our guard down. That night, as I lay in my makeshift bed, I thought about the journey ahead. The guide had been right so far, and I hoped it would continue to lead us to safety. But doubt lingered. How much of this was real, and how much was paranoia? Only time would tell. Before drifting off to sleep, I made a mental note to be more cautious and observant. The road ahead was uncertain, but we had to trust the guide and each other. Our survival depended on it. We woke early the next morning, the chill of the mountain air seeping through the cabin walls. Despite our relative safety, none of us slept soundly. The guide's predictions had been disturbingly accurate so far, and we knew we couldn't stay in one place for long. It was time to head north to the network of caves, our next safe haven. Packing up was quick and efficient. We had only brought essentials, and everything had a designated spot in our bags. Mrs. Thompson, John, and I shared a silent understanding. Each of us knew our roles and responsibilities. We had to stay focused and alert. Before we left, we double-checked the map pinned to the wall. The route to the caves was marked with precise detail, including potential hazards and checkpoints to avoid. The guide's meticulousness was both a blessing and a curse. It meant someone had been here before us, but it also meant they might have faced dangers we had yet to encounter. The drive was uneventful at first. The winding mountain roads were deserted, and the early morning fog lent an eerie silence to the landscape. Every so often I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a convoy of dark uniformed agents on our tail, but the road behind us remained empty. We stopped briefly at a small abandoned gas station to refuel and stretch our legs. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years, covered in rust and overgrown weeds. As John filled the tank, Mrs. Thompson and I scouted the area for supplies. Inside the station, we found a few cans of food and some bottled water. Small victories that lifted our spirits. Back on the road, the terrain became rougher, the asphalt giving way to gravel and dirt. The guide had warned about this, suggesting we might need to abandon the car at some point and proceed on foot. We kept a close eye on the map, noting landmarks and making sure we were on the right track. As we drove, we noticed more signs of the apocalypse unfolding. The small town we passed through was eerily quiet, its streets empty and storefronts boarded up. It looked like people had left in a hurry, leaving behind a ghost town. We didn't stop, fearing what might be lurking in the shadows. It was late afternoon when we finally reached the point where the road ended. From here, we'd have to hike the rest of the way to the caves. We parked the car in a concealed spot, covering it with branches and foliage to hide it from prying eyes. Then, we shouldered our packs and set off into the forest. The hike was grueling, the terrain rugged and the path unclear. We relied heavily on the guide's directions, which led us through dense underbrush and steep inclines. Despite the difficulty, we moved quickly, driven by the urgency of our situation. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves put us on edge, but we pressed on. As dusk approached, we finally reached the entrance to the cave network. It was a narrow opening in the rock face, almost hidden by the surrounding foliage. According to the guide, this was one of the safest places we could find, a natural fortress that provided shelter and a defensible position. We entered cautiously, using our flashlights to navigate the dark, winding passages. The air inside was cool and damp, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the caverns. We found a central chamber that would serve as our base, setting up our supplies and making a small fire for warmth. That night, as we sat around the fire, we discussed our next steps. The guide mentioned that these caves were part of a larger network that extended for miles, some sections leading to other safe havens. It also suggested that the deeper parts of the caves might contain resources left by other survivors, food, medical supplies, even weapons. We should explore further tomorrow, John suggested, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. See if we can find anything useful. Mrs. Thompson and I agreed. It was risky, but we needed to know more about our surroundings and secure as many resources as possible. The caves offered safety for now, but we couldn't rely on luck alone. As we settled in for the night, I couldn't help but think about the journey ahead. The guide had been our lifeline, its predictions and instructions guiding us through the chaos. But there were still so many unknowns. What had happened to the author? Were there other survivors out there following the same path? And most importantly, what would we do when the aliens finally arrived? Sleep came slowly, my mind racing with these questions. The darkness of the cave felt both comforting and claustrophobic, a stark reminder of the precariousness of our situation. We were safe for now, but the world outside was changing rapidly, and we had to be ready for anything. The next morning, we woke early, eager to explore the deeper parts of the cave. We packed light, bringing only what we needed and leaving most of our supplies in the central chamber. The guide's notes on the cave network were vague, but it hinted at hidden chambers and passages that might lead to other safe havens. The deeper we ventured, the more complex the cave system became. Some passages were narrow and treacherous, requiring us to squeeze through tight spaces or climb over slippery rocks. Despite the challenges, we pressed on, driven by the hope of finding something that could aid our survival. After several hours of exploration, we stumbled upon a large chamber filled with crates and supplies. It was a veritable treasure trove: canned food, bottled water, medical kits, and even some basic tools and weapons. The sight of these supplies brought a wave of relief. We weren't alone in our struggle. Others had been here and left behind resources for future survivors. We spent the rest of the day inventorying and organizing our findings, ensuring we knew exactly what we had. The guide's predictions and instructions had once again proven invaluable. leading us to a cache of supplies that would sustain us for weeks, if not months. That night, as we sat around the fire, our spirits were higher than they had been in days. We had a plan, a safe haven, and the resources to survive. But the looming threat of the alien apocalypse still hung over us, a constant reminder of the dangers we faced. As I lay in my makeshift bed, I thought about the journey ahead. The guide had led us this far, but we still had a long way to go. The alien invasion was imminent, and we needed to be prepared for whatever came next. With each passing day, the reality of our situation became clearer, and the importance of staying vigilant and resourceful grew. We were survivors, guided by the knowledge and predictions of a mysterious e-book from the dark web. The path ahead was uncertain, but we were determined to face it together, trusting in each other and the guide that had brought us this far. The alien apocalypse was coming, and we had to be ready. The next few days in the cave were a blur of activity. We spent our time fortifying our shelter, rationing our newfound supplies, and planning our next move. The guide had mentioned other survivors and potential allies, and we decided to reach out and find them. It was risky, but strength in numbers could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Our first contact came unexpectedly. One evening, as we were preparing dinner, we heard a faint, echoing voice from deeper within the cave. We all froze, exchanging cautious glances. John signaled for us to stay quiet as he moved towards the sound. "Hello?" The voice called again, this time closer. It was a woman's voice, sounding both desperate and cautious. John responded, "We're here. Who are you?" A few tense moments passed before a figure emerged from the darkness. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with a weary but determined look on her face. She introduced herself as Emily, a fellow survivor who had been following the same guide. Emily's story mirrored our own. She had noticed the signs, downloaded the guide, and started preparing. She had been on the run for weeks, narrowly escaping capture by the dark uniformed agents several times. Her relief at finding us was palpable, and we welcomed her into our group. With Emily's arrival, our small community grew stronger. She brought new skills and knowledge, having been a paramedic before the apocalypse began. Her medical expertise proved invaluable, and she quickly set up a makeshift infirmary in one of the smaller chambers. Despite our growing confidence, we remained vigilant. The guide had been right about everything so far, and its warnings about the aliens and their human collaborators loomed large in our minds. We took turns keeping watch, ensuring that any approach to the cave was monitored. One evening during my watch, I noticed something strange in the distance. It was a soft pulsating light similar to the ones we had seen in the sky before. My heart raced as I watched it move slowly through the forest, heading in our direction. I alerted the others, and we quickly extinguished our fire, plunging the cave into darkness. We huddled together, listening intently as the light drew closer. The guide had warned about these searchlights, claiming they were used by the aliens to locate human hideouts. We stayed silent, barely daring to breathe as the light swept over the entrance to the cave. The tension was unbearable. Seconds felt like hours as the light lingered, searching. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it moved away, disappearing into the night. We remained still for a long time, ensuring it was truly gone before we dared to move. "That was too close," John whispered, his face pale in the dim light of our flashlights. Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to be more careful. They're getting closer." The incident served as a stark reminder of the dangers we faced. We redoubled our efforts to remain hidden, setting up more elaborate camouflage and even moving some of our supplies deeper into the cave. We also started discussing contingency plans in case we had to leave in a hurry. As the days passed, we encountered more signs of the apocalypse unfolding around us. The skies were often filled with strange lights, and distant thunderous noises hinted at battles being fought far away. We could only imagine the chaos unfolding in the cities and towns we had left behind. Despite the growing threat, we continued to follow the guide's instructions. It had been our lifeline, and its detailed predictions had kept us one step ahead. But the more accurate it proved to be, the more questions I had. Who had written it? How did they know so much about the aliens and their plans? And most importantly, where were they now? One morning, Emily brought up a crucial point during our planning session. We need to start thinking about long-term survival. The guide mentions other safe havens, but it doesn't tell us how to sustain ourselves indefinitely. She was right. Our supplies, though plentiful for now, wouldn't last forever. We needed a way to replenish our resources and ensure our continued survival. The guide had hinted at sustainable practices, such as foraging and farming, but we hadn't had the chance to implement them yet. We decided to take a calculated risk and venture out to gather more supplies. Emily and John volunteered for the mission, leaving Mrs. Thompson and me to hold down the fort. We went over the plan repeatedly, ensuring they knew the safest routes and what to do if they encountered any threats. The day they left was nerve-wracking. Mrs. Thompson and I kept busy, trying to distract ourselves from the worry gnawing at our minds. Hours passed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, as dusk approached, we heard footsteps at the cave entrance. Emily and John returned, their packs full of supplies and their faces grim. They had successfully foraged for food and even found a small abandoned farm where they gathered seeds and tools. But they had also seen signs of increased activity, more searchlights, more agents, and evidence of people being rounded up. "It's getting worse out there," John said, unpacking the supplies. "We need to be prepared for anything." That night, we sat around our small fire, discussing the future. The guide had led us this far, but it couldn't answer all our questions or solve all our problems. We had to rely on our wits, our skills, and each other. As I lay in my makeshift bed, I couldn't help but think about the journey ahead. The guide had been our lifeline, but we were entering uncharted territory. The alien apocalypse was unfolding around us, and we had to be ready for whatever came next. Our survival depended on it. The weeks that followed Emily and John's return were a blur of activity. We fortified the cave, planted the seeds they had found, and set up a sustainable water collection system. The guide's predictions continued to hold true, and we became more adept at interpreting its advice. Despite the growing danger, we found a rhythm, a fragile semblance of normalcy. But that normalcy was shattered one fateful night. We were gathered around our fire, discussing our next steps, when we heard the unmistakable hum of a drone. It was a sound we had dreaded, a clear sign that we had been discovered. John was the first to react, dousing the fire with a bucket of sand. "We need to move now," he whispered urgently. We grabbed our pre-packed emergency bags and hurried deeper into the cave. The drone's hum grew louder, echoing through the caverns. We could see the faint glow of its searchlight probing the entrance. Our hearts pounded as we navigated the dark passages, relying on our flashlights to guide us. The guide had mentioned this scenario, providing detailed instructions on how to evade detection. We followed its advice, taking the narrowest and most convoluted paths to confuse any pursuers. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a hidden chamber that the guide had described as a fallback point. We sat in silence, listening intently. The hum of the drone eventually faded, but our relief was short-lived. Emily, who had been keeping watch at the entrance, returned with a grave expression. "They're coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A ground team is moving in. We don't have much time." We quickly discussed our options. The guide had provided multiple escape routes, but they were all risky. We decided to split up, hoping that at least some of us would make it to safety. John and Mrs. Thompson would take one route, Emily and I another. Before we parted ways, Mrs. Thompson grabbed my hand. "Stay safe, dear," she said, her eyes filled with worry. "We'll meet again, I promise." Emily and I navigated the dark passages, our flashlights flickering in the cold, damp air. The further we went, the more treacherous the terrain became. At one point, we had to crawl through a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough to accommodate our bodies. Every sound seemed amplified, and every shadow felt like a threat. We finally emerged into a hidden valley, far from the main entrance. The moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape, illuminating our path. We moved quickly but cautiously, staying in the shadows to avoid detection. Our destination was another safe haven mentioned in the guide, a remote farmhouse believed to be abandoned. It was several miles away, and the journey would be arduous. We traveled through the night, taking only short breaks to catch our breath and reassess our route. As dawn approached, we saw the farmhouse in the distance. It was a dilapidated structure, overgrown with weeds and vines, but it offered a glimmer of hope. We approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of life or danger. The farmhouse was empty, just as the guide had indicated. We quickly secured the doors and windows, setting up a temporary camp inside. The sense of relief was overwhelming. We had made it, at least for now. We spent the next few days fortifying our new shelter and exploring the surrounding area. Emily proved invaluable, her medical skills helping us treat minor injuries and maintain our health. We found a nearby stream that provided fresh water, and the farmhouse's old garden offered a chance to grow our own food. Despite the relative safety, we knew we couldn't stay here forever. The guide had been clear: constant movement and adaptability were key to survival. We needed to find other survivors and build a network of safe havens. One evening, as we sat by a small fire in the farmhouse's living room, Emily spoke up. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice thoughtful. "What if we try to contact the author of the guide? They must have known something, right? Maybe they're still out there." It was a bold idea, but it made sense. The guide had been our lifeline, and finding its author could provide invaluable information and support. We decided to search for clues, starting with the final section of the guide that we had yet to fully explore. The last pages of the guide contained cryptic messages and coordinates, hinting at a central command or safe zone. We deciphered the clues as best we could, piecing together a rough location in the northern mountains. The journey would be perilous, but we were determined. We packed our supplies and set off, leaving behind the farmhouse that had been our sanctuary. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but we had come this far, and there was no turning back. As we traveled, we encountered other survivors, each with their own stories of struggle and resilience. We shared information and resources, building a loose network of allies. The guide's predictions continued to guide us, its accuracy both a comfort and a mystery. Weeks passed, and we finally reached the coordinates indicated in the guide. It was a secluded valley, hidden deep within the mountains. There, we found a small community of survivors, all of whom had followed the same guide. Among them was the author, a man named Dr. Richard Hayes. He had been a scientist working on classified projects before the apocalypse began. He had seen the signs early and used his knowledge to create the guide, hoping to help others survive. Dr. Hayes welcomed us warmly, explaining that his guide was based on years of research and inside information. He had known about the alien threat long before it became public and had dedicated his life to preparing for it. With Dr. Hayes' guidance, we joined the community, working together to build a new society. The road ahead was still uncertain, but we had hope. The alien apocalypse had brought us together, forging bonds of trust and cooperation. As I looked around at our new home, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. The journey had been long and arduous, but we had made it. We were survivors, guided by the wisdom of a mysterious ebook and the strength of our shared determination. The alien apocalypse was far from over, but we were ready. With the knowledge we had gained and the allies we had found, we faced the future with courage and hope. The guide had been our lifeline, and now it was our path to rebuilding a better world. As I sat by the fire, surrounded by new friends and old, I realized that survival was just the beginning. Together, we would find a way to thrive in this new world, guided by the lessons of the past and the promise of the future. I've always had a fascination with the strange and unexplained. It started with ghost stories around the campfire as a kid and evolved into a late-night obsession with paranormal documentaries. But as I grew older, the need for something more tangible, something real, became almost overwhelming. That's what led me to the darkest corners of the internet, the dark web. For those unfamiliar, the dark web is an unregulated hidden part of the internet, where anything and everything can be bought or sold, no questions asked. It's not somewhere you go lightly, and definitely not a place for the faint of heart. But I was curious, and more importantly, I was desperate. My grandfather passed away a few years ago. He was my hero, my mentor, and my best friend. We had a bond that I've never experienced with anyone else. When he died, it happened so suddenly that I never got the chance to say goodbye. This left a void in my heart that nothing seemed to fill. I tried everything: therapy, self-help books, even attending seances, but nothing worked. That's when I stumbled upon an online forum discussing dark web services, and one post in particular caught my eye. Speak to the dead, guaranteed results. The post was straightforward and eerie. The poster claimed to have a method to communicate with the deceased, but the service came with a hefty price tag payable in Bitcoin. Skeptical yet intrigued, I started researching more about this mysterious individual. The reviews were mixed, as expected, but a few stood out, detailing experiences that seemed far too specific and accurate to be simple guesses or scams. I was hooked. Creating a Bitcoin wallet and purchasing the necessary cryptocurrency was a challenge in itself, but eventually I managed to transfer the required amount. The instructions that followed were chillingly simple. Provide the name and last known address of the deceased and send a personal item to a specified address. I had my doubts, but the prospect of potentially speaking to my grandfather one last time was too tempting to ignore. I dug through my belongings, searching for something that held a piece of my grandfather's essence. Finally, I found it, a small pocket watch he used to carry everywhere. It was old and worn, but it was his. I packaged it carefully and sent it to the address provided, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread. A week later, I received an email. The subject line read, "Contact established." My heart raced as I opened it. The message was brief and to the point. "Your request has been processed. You will receive a phone call at 3 a.m. tonight. Be alone." That night I barely slept. Every noise in the house seemed amplified, and the ticking of the clock was almost unbearable. When my phone finally rang at 3 a.m., I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. With trembling hands, I answered. A voice on the other end, deep and calm, spoke. "Are you ready to speak with your grandfather?" I could barely breathe. "Yes," I managed to whisper. There was a pause, then the voice continued, reciting details about my grandfather's life that were shockingly accurate. Things only he and I knew. My skepticism wavered, replaced by an eerie sense of hope. The voice then said, "He is here. You may speak." Tears streamed down my face as I spoke into the darkness, sharing memories and regrets, telling him everything I wished I had said before he died. The responses I received were uncanny, mirroring my grandfather's tone and mannerisms. Whether it was real or a masterful deception, I didn't care. For that brief moment, I felt connected to him again. When the call ended, I felt a strange sense of peace. Real or not, I had my closure. But that was just the beginning. Little did I know what I had set in motion would soon take a turn far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. After that fateful night, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Speaking to my grandfather, or at least believing I had, gave me a sense of closure I desperately needed. But something lingered in the back of my mind, a gnawing feeling that I couldn't shake. It was as if I had opened a door that wasn't meant to be opened, and now something was peering through. The following days were filled with an eerie calm. Life seemed to go on as usual, but every now and then I noticed small, unsettling changes around my house. It started with little things. Objects moved from their usual places, lights flickering without reason, and a cold draft that seemed to follow me from room to room. I chalked it up to paranoia, a side effect of delving into something as dark and mysterious as the service I'd used. One evening, about a week after the call, I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone, when I received a text message from an unknown number. It simply read, "How's Grandpa?" My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. How could anyone know about that? I hadn't told a soul about my experience. I responded cautiously, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "A friend. We're watching." Fear gripped me. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Someone, somewhere knew what I had done, and they were making it clear that they were keeping an eye on me. I tried to convince myself it was just a cruel prank, but the timing and the specificity were too perfect to be mere coincidence. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning with anxiety. Around 3 a.m., the same time as the call from the medium, I heard a faint whispering sound coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, listening intently. The whispers grew louder, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like multiple voices overlapping, creating a haunting, unintelligible chorus. Summoning all my courage, I crept out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the whispers continued, now seeming to come from the living room. As I slowly made my way downstairs, the air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I flicked on the light, and the whispers abruptly stopped. The living room looked just as it always did, nothing out of place. But the silence was deafening, and the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. I decided enough was enough. I grabbed my laptop and began searching for ways to reverse whatever I had done. Maybe there was a way to sever the connection or undo the ritual. After hours of fruitless searching, I stumbled upon a discussion thread on a hidden forum. It was filled with people sharing their own experiences with dark web services, many of them eerily similar to mine. One post stood out, warning that contacting the dead through these means often left a door open for other, less benevolent entities. The only way to close it, according to the poster, was to perform a cleansing ritual involving salt and sage. Desperate, I decided to follow the instructions. I bought salt and sage from a local store and prepared the ritual that night. As I walked through my house, sprinkling salt in the corners and burning sage, I felt a strange mix of hope and fear. The smoke filled the rooms, and I repeated the incantations I had found online, praying for this nightmare to end. As the night wore on, the house seemed to grow quieter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. I hoped it was working. Exhausted, I finally collapsed into bed, falling into a restless sleep. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences seemed to diminish. The whispers stopped, and the house felt warmer, more like home again. But the peace was fragile, and I knew that whatever I had invited in wasn't entirely gone. I had tampered with forces I didn't understand, and the repercussions were far from over. Little did I know the true cost of my curiosity was yet to reveal itself, and the next encounter would be more personal and terrifying than I could have ever imagined. Despite the initial success of the cleansing ritual, the sense of unease never completely left. I tried to resume a normal routine, but the memory of those chilling whispers and the cryptic text messages haunted me. It was like a dark cloud hanging over my life, casting shadows that never seemed to dissipate. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed again with a message from the same unknown number. "You think it's over? It's just beginning." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The message was a stark reminder that whatever I had done, it wasn't finished with me yet. I decided to ignore the message, hoping that giving it no attention would somehow make it go away. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned off the lights and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced with thoughts of who or what could be behind this. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud thud coming from downstairs. My heart pounded as I listened closely. Another thud followed, and then the unmistakable sound of something shuffling across the floor. Summoning my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed down the stairs. The living room was dark, and the only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, eerie shadows. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but everything seemed in place. Just as I was about to turn around, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. My blood ran cold. I was certain I had locked it before going to bed. I cautiously approached the door and shut it, making sure it was securely locked this time. As I turned back towards the stairs, I heard a faint, raspy whisper right behind me. "You can't escape." I spun around, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me, and I raced back up to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had someone broken in? Or was it something else? Something not of this world? The next day, I decided to install security cameras around the house. I needed to know if there was a physical intruder, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The installation process took most of the day, but by evening, I felt a bit more secure knowing I could monitor my home. That night, I sat in front of the monitor, watching the live feed from the cameras. For hours, nothing happened. I was starting to think that maybe it had all been in my head. But then, just as I was about to call it a night, I saw it. A shadowy figure moving across the living room. It was tall and indistinct, more like a dense mist than a person. My heart raced as I watched it glide towards the stairs. I ran to my bedroom, locking the door and grabbing my phone. I opened the security app and watched as the figure seemed to dissolve before reaching the top of the stairs. I didn't sleep at all that night, my mind filled with dread. The following day, I reached out to the forum where I had originally found the dark web service. I posted about my experience, hoping for some advice. Most responses were unhelpful, dismissing my story as a prank or telling me to seek professional help. But one response stood out. A user with the handle Seeker42 messaged me privately, claiming to have had a similar experience. Seeker42 explained that contacting the dead through these dark web services often attracted malevolent spirits or entities posing as our loved ones. They suggested I perform a more powerful cleansing ritual and advised me to seek help from a professional medium or paranormal investigator. Desperate, I followed their advice. I found a reputable medium in my area and explained my situation. She agreed to come to my house and perform a thorough cleansing. When she arrived, the air in the house seemed to grow colder, as if the very presence of the medium disturbed whatever was lingering. She spent hours performing the ritual, burning sage, sprinkling holy water, and chanting incantations in a language I didn't understand. As she worked, I could feel a heavy weight lifting, the oppressive atmosphere gradually dissipating. By the time she was finished, the house felt lighter, more peaceful. The medium warned me, however, that the connection I had made was strong, and it might take more than one session to fully sever it. She also advised me to get rid of any items connected to the ritual, including the pocket watch I had sent. Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing it was the only way to truly move on. For a while, things seemed to improve. The strange occurrences stopped, and I began to feel at ease in my own home again. But deep down, I knew that the peace was fragile, and that any slip-up could bring the darkness back. Little did I know the final chapter of this ordeal was just around the corner, and it would force me to confront my greatest fears head-on. For a few weeks, life seemed to return to normal. The house was peaceful, and I started to believe that the medium's cleansing ritual had worked. However, a lingering sense of dread stayed with me. like a shadow that wouldn't quite disappear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. One evening, as I was winding down from a long day at work, I received another text message from the unknown number. This time, it simply said, "Remember me?" My heart sank. The entity hadn't been banished. It was still there, lurking in the background. Determined not to be a prisoner in my own home, I decided to confront whatever it was directly. I reconnected with Seeker 42, the forum user who had previously offered advice. They suggested I try a different approach. Instead of attempting to banish the entity, I should try to understand what it wanted. According to them, some spirits linger because of unfinished business or a message that needs to be delivered. With a mix of fear and resolve, I prepared for another night of communication. I set up a small table in the living room with a candle, a piece of paper, and a pen. I turned off all the lights, leaving only the flickering candle flame to cast long shadows on the walls. I took a deep breath and called out, "If you're still here, show yourself. Tell me what you want." At first, there was nothing but silence. Then the temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and the candle flickered violently. I watched in horror as the pen on the table lifted and began to scribble on the paper. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay still and watch. The pen moved erratically, but eventually, words started to form. It wrote, "Help me. Trapped. Not who you think." I stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. "Trapped? Not who I think," I whispered, confusion mixing with fear. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the room, a voice that was eerily familiar. "Help me, please, it's not your grandfather." The realization hit me like a truck. Whatever I had contacted wasn't my grandfather, but something else entirely. It had been using my grief and longing to manipulate me. I needed more answers. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked aloud. The candle flame grew brighter, illuminating the room in an unnatural light. The voice responded, "I am a spirit trapped between worlds, imprisoned by your actions. You must set me free." My mind raced, trying to understand what it meant. How? How can I set you free? The pen moved again, writing out, "Destroy the watch. It binds me here." The pocket watch. The item I had sent as part of the ritual. It all made sense now. The watch was the key, the anchor that held this entity in my world. I rushed to the drawer where I had stored it after retrieving it from the address. The moment I touched the watch, I felt a cold shock run through my body. It was as if the entity's presence was concentrated in this one object. With trembling hands, I took the watch outside to the backyard. I found a heavy rock and, with all my strength, smashed the watch repeatedly until it was nothing but a pile of broken metal and glass. As the watch shattered, I felt a sudden rush of warm air, as if the oppressive presence had been lifted. Back inside, the atmosphere was different. The air was lighter and the sense of dread was gone. I returned to the living room where the pen and paper still lay on the table. The final message on the paper read, "Thank you. I am free." Relief washed over me, mixed with a tinge of sadness. I had been so desperate to speak to my grandfather that I had unwittingly invited something else into my life. But now, it was over. The entity was gone, and I could finally move on. I decided to leave the dark web behind for good, deleting all traces of my involvement. It wasn't worth the risk or the fear. Some doors are better left unopened, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. As I settled back into my life, I felt a newfound peace. I knew my grandfather would want me to let go of the past and live my life fully. And though I never got to say goodbye, I believed he understood. The dark web experience had taught me a valuable lesson about the dangers of tampering with the unknown. Little did I know, the final chapter of my story was yet to come, a chapter that would reveal the true cost of my curiosity and the unexpected twist that awaited me. With the watch destroyed and the entity seemingly banished, I thought the ordeal was finally over. Life gradually returned to normal, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace and closure. I no longer felt watched or haunted by unseen forces, and the house felt like my sanctuary again. Weeks went by and I started to rebuild my routines. Work, friends, and hobbies filled my days, and the dark web experience became a distant, albeit unsettling memory. I kept my promise to myself to stay away from anything related to the paranormal or the dark web. It was a chapter of my life, best left closed. One sunny Saturday afternoon, I decided to visit my grandfather's grave, something I hadn't done in a long time. I felt it was a good way to pay my respects and finally say a proper goodbye. I bought a bouquet of his favorite flowers, white lilies, and drove to the cemetery. The cemetery was quiet, with only the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. As I approached my grandfather's grave, a sense of calm washed over me. I knelt down, placing the flowers gently on the headstone, and sat there in silence, reflecting on the memories we shared. "Hi, Grandpa," I began softly. "I miss you. I hope you're at peace." As I sat there, I felt an odd sensation, like a warm embrace wrapping around me. It wasn't frightening. It was comforting. It felt as if my grandfather was there with me, reassuring me. Tears welled up in my eyes, but they were tears of release and relief. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my reverie. I frowned, annoyed at the interruption. When I checked the screen, I saw a message from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat. Hesitantly, I opened the message. It read, "Thank you for setting me free. Your grandfather is proud." A shiver ran down my spine, but it wasn't the same fear I had felt before. This message felt different, more like a closure. I looked around, half expecting to see someone, but the cemetery was empty. I took a deep breath, deciding to accept the message as a final goodbye from the spirit I had inadvertently contacted. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this experience than I had understood. Who had sent that message? How did they know? Was it truly a spirit, or had someone been watching me all along? That night, as I sat in my living room, reflecting on everything that had happened, I received another message. This time it was from Seeker42, the forum user who had helped me. It read, "There's one last thing you should know. The spirits you encounter can sometimes leave a mark, a reminder of their presence. Stay vigilant." The message was cryptic, but it didn't fill me with dread like the others had. Instead, it felt like a final piece of advice, a warning to remain cautious. I thanked Seeker42 for their help and decided to heed their warning. In the days that followed, I made a conscious effort to stay grounded in reality. I focused on my work, spent time with friends and family, and avoided any temptations to delve back into the paranormal. Life had taught me a valuable lesson about the dangers of curiosity and the unknown. One evening, as I was tidying up, I found an old photo album tucked away in a drawer. Flipping through the pages, I came across a picture of my grandfather and me, taken when I was a child. We were at the park, both of us laughing, and he had his arm around my shoulders. I smiled, feeling a warmth in my heart. As I placed the album back, I noticed a small handwritten note fall out from between the pages. It was in my grandfather's handwriting. The note read, "Remember, I'm always with you." Tears filled my eyes once more, but this time they were tears of joy and comfort. I knew then that, regardless of the supernatural experience I had gone through, my grandfather's spirit and love would always be a part of me. The dark web, the entity, and the strange occurrences were now just a part of my story, a chapter that had finally come to a close. And so, I moved forward, carrying the lessons and the memories with me, grateful for the chance to say goodbye, and to embrace the future with a heart full of love and a spirit unburdened by fear. I've always been a bit of a tech geek, fascinated by the hidden corners of the internet. You know, those places everyone tells you to avoid. Curiosity got the better of me one rainy evening, and I found myself diving into the depths of the dark web. I'd heard stories about the bizarre and downright creepy stuff you could find there, but I figured most of it was exaggerated. Still, the thrill of the unknown was too enticing to resist. Setting up my VPN and Tor browser, I felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. The process itself was surprisingly straightforward. After a few clicks and some patient waiting, I was in. The interface was primitive, almost like the early days of the internet. Anonymous forums, illegal marketplaces, and chat rooms filled the screen. I navigated cautiously, avoiding anything blatantly illegal. It was during this exploration that I stumbled upon a chat room titled Obscura Veritas. The name intrigued me, Latin for hidden truth. I hesitated for a moment before clicking the link. The chat room was surprisingly active, filled with people discussing everything from conspiracy theories to supposed supernatural encounters. The conversations were intense, almost feverish, but nothing seemed too outlandish at first glance. I lurked silently, absorbing the chatter. Most users seemed to revel in the anonymity the dark web provided, sharing stories and secrets they wouldn't dare voice in the daylight. It was thrilling in a way, being part of this hidden community. I started engaging in conversations, sharing my own theories and listening to others. That's when things took a turn for the bizarre. A user with the handle Watcher42 began posting cryptic messages. At first, it was just odd trivia, strange facts about historical events, obscure references to ancient texts. But then, Watcher42 began directing his messages at specific users, sharing details that no anonymous stranger should know. He talked about a user's hometown, their childhood pet, even their recent activities. It was unnerving, but most people laughed it off as a skilled hacker showing off. I was intrigued, but wary. I made sure to keep my personal information vague, never revealing anything too specific. One evening, however, things escalated. Watcher42 posted an image, an old, grainy photograph of a house. I recognized it instantly. It was my friend Jake's house. Alongside the image was a detailed description of the address and the surrounding neighborhood. My heart raced. What the hell was Jake doing sharing this? I quickly typed a message, asking Watcher42 where he got the photo. His response was chillingly simple, from a reliable source. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. I logged off immediately and grabbed my phone, dialing Jake's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Hey man, what's up?" "Jake, are you out of your mind?" I blurted out, barely containing my panic. "Why would you share a photo of your house on the dark web?" "What are you talking about?" he replied, confusion evident in his tone. I quickly explained the situation, recounting every detail of the chat room, the photo, and the address. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Dude, I have no idea what you're talking about," Jake finally said. "I've never even been on the dark web." A cold shiver ran down my spine. If Jake didn't post the photo, then who did? And more importantly, how did they get it? I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach as the reality of the situation sank in. Someone out there had personal information about my friend, and they were sharing it in a place filled with anonymous strangers. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The following morning, I decided it was time to report this to the authorities. I wasn't sure how they would react, but it felt like the only option. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would only get darker. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in a police station, giving my statement about the events of the previous night. The officers took it seriously, though they seemed as puzzled as I was. As I recounted the story, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. What had I stumbled into? And who was Watcher42? This was only the beginning, and I had a sinking feeling that things were going to get a lot worse before they got better. The days following my visit to the police station were a blur. I couldn't shake the anxiety that had taken root in my mind. Every noise outside my window, every unexpected phone call, made me jump. I kept my curtains closed and double-checked the locks on my doors. Paranoia was becoming my constant companion. Jake, on the other hand, seemed to be handling the situation with more calm. He assured me that he hadn't noticed anything unusual around his house, but he took my warning seriously. We agreed to stay in close contact and report any suspicious activity to each other immediately. I couldn't let go of the nagging feeling that there was more to this than a simple prank or a hacker showing off. I decided to dive back into the dark web, determined to find some answers. This time I was more cautious. I created a new anonymous profile, using a different VPN, and taking extra steps to mask my identity. Back in the Obscura Veritas chat room, the atmosphere was as intense as ever. Watcher 42's presence loomed large, his cryptic messages stirring up the users. I noticed a few new handles that seemed to be interacting with Watcher 42 more frequently, almost as if they were part of an inner circle. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper connection between these users. One night, I mustered the courage to directly message one of them, a user named Raven Black. I carefully crafted my message, aiming to seem curious but not suspicious. "Hey Raven Black, do you know who Watcher 42 is? He seems to know a lot about people." The response came quickly. "Watcher 42 is an enigma. Some say he's a genius, others think he's a psycho. Why do you ask?" I hesitated before typing out my next message. He posted something about my friend, something very personal. I need to know how he got that information. There was a long pause. I could almost feel Raven Black weighing their response. "Be careful digging too deep. Watcher 42 has connections. People who don't want to be found. If he's targeting you, there's a reason. Best to stay low." The warning sent a chill down my spine. I thanked Raven Black and logged off, my mind racing. If Watcher 42 had connections, who were they? And why were they targeting Jake and me? I spent hours piecing together fragments of conversations trying to find a pattern. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The more I delved, the more questions I had. But one thing was clear. Watcher 42 wasn't working alone. There was a network of individuals, each playing a part in this twisted game. In the midst of my search, I came across a particularly disturbing thread. It detailed stories of users being doxxed, their personal information leaked for all to see. The common thread? They had all crossed paths with Watcher 42. Some had ignored his warnings, others had tried to expose him. None of their stories ended well. I was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a game, it was a carefully orchestrated operation, and I had unwittingly become a part of it. Late one night, as I was about to shut down my computer, a new message notification popped up. It was from Watcher 42. "Hello, my username. Enjoying the hunt?" My blood ran cold. How did he know I was investigating him? I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could I say? What should I say? Before I could respond, another message appeared. "Curiosity killed the cat, don't let it kill you too." I logged off immediately, my heart pounding. This was no idle threat. Watcher 42 was aware of my every move. I felt a deep sense of dread, realizing just how exposed I was. Despite the precautions I had taken, he was still a step ahead. I called Jake, my voice trembling as I relayed the latest development. We agreed it was time to go back to the police with this new information. It wasn't just about the photo anymore, it was about our safety. The next morning, we sat in a small, sterile room at the police station, recounting everything that had happened since my last visit. The officers took detailed notes, their expressions growing more serious with each new piece of information. "We'll look into it," one of them said, though his tone suggested he was still skeptical. "In the meantime, make sure to keep your online presence minimal and avoid any suspicious activities. As we left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Watcher 42 was still out there, watching, waiting. The dark web had drawn us into its depths, and I feared we were only beginning to understand the true extent of its reach. Little did I know, the real nightmare was just beginning. The days following our second visit to the police station were tense. Jake and I kept our communication strictly offline, meeting in person to discuss our next steps. Every message we had received from Watcher 42 played on a loop in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Despite our caution, life had to go on. Jake and I both had jobs and responsibilities that couldn't be ignored, but the normalcy of our daily routines felt strained, like a thin veneer over a bubbling anxiety. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unexpected noise. One evening, I was sitting at my desk, attempting to catch up on some work, when my phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from an unknown number. "Check your email." My heart sank. I knew better than to ignore the message, but I also feared what I might find. With a deep breath, I opened my laptop and logged into my email. There it was, an email from an unfamiliar address, the subject line reading, "A little reminder." I clicked on it, my stomach knotting with dread. The email contained a single sentence: "Stay out of places you don't belong." Attached was a photo. This time it was my house. The picture was recent, taken from an angle that suggested someone had been standing just across the street. Panic surged through me. I immediately called Jake, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. He agreed to come over right away. As I waited for him, I couldn't help but peek through the curtains, scanning the street for any sign of someone watching. When Jake arrived, we sat in my living room, the tension between us palpable. He was just as alarmed as I was, and we both knew we couldn't handle this alone anymore. "We need to find out who's behind this," Jake said, his voice resolute. "But we need to be smarter about it. No more logging onto the dark web from our homes. We'll use public Wi-Fi, change locations frequently." I nodded, appreciating his clear-headedness. We made a plan to visit a nearby cafe with free Wi-Fi the next day, hoping to gather more information without compromising our safety. The following day, we set up in a corner of the cafe, our laptops open, but our eyes constantly darting around, checking for anything out of the ordinary. I logged into the dark web using yet another new profile, feeling the familiar rush of fear and excitement. Back in the Obscura Veritas chat room, things seemed as chaotic as ever. I navigated through the threads, looking for any mention of Watcher 42. To my surprise, there was a new topic pinned to the top of the chat room: recent events and caution. Curious, I clicked on it. The post was written by a moderator named Shade, warning users to be extra vigilant due to increased attention from law enforcement. It advised against sharing personal information and suggested that anyone feeling targeted should immediately cease all activity on the dark web. My heart raced as I read through the comments. It was clear that others had experienced similar threats, but there was a sense of resignation among the users. They seemed to accept these dangers as part of the territory. As I scrolled, I noticed a reply from Watcher 42. "Those who seek shall find. Be wise or be gone." I took a deep breath and decided to take a risk. Using my anonymous profile, I posted a message. "Watcher 42, why target us? We just want answers." The response was almost immediate. "Curiosity isn't a crime, but it's often punished. Leave while you can." Before I could respond, another message popped up from Raven Black. "Meet me in private chat." I hesitated, but then accepted the invitation. The private chat window opened, and Raven Black's message appeared. "Listen, you're in over your head. Watcher 42 isn't just a person, it's a network. They have eyes everywhere. If you keep digging, they'll come after you." I typed quickly, my hands shaking. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I've been there," Raven Black replied. I got out, but it cost me. If you want to stay safe, you need to disappear. Erase your digital footprint. Cut ties with this world. I glanced at Jake, who was watching my screen intently. I relayed Ravenblack's warning, and he nodded grimly. "Thank you," I typed back. "We'll do what we can." As I logged off, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. We left the cafe, our minds racing with the gravity of what we had learned. The threat was real, and it was closer than we had ever imagined. Over the next few days, Jake and I took steps to distance ourselves from the dark web. We wiped our devices, changed our online habits, and stayed alert. But the fear lingered, a constant reminder of the shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. Despite our efforts, we knew that the network behind Watcher 42 was vast and resourceful. We could only hope that by retreating, we might find some semblance of peace. Yet deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The dark web had a way of pulling you back in, and I feared what might happen if it did. The nightmarish experience had changed us, making us more cautious and aware of the dangers lurking in the unseen corners of the internet. And as we tried to return to our normal lives, the question remained, would we ever truly be free from the web of Watcher 42? Weeks passed, and although the tension had eased slightly, a lingering sense of dread shadowed every step we took. Jake and I did our best to return to our daily routines, but the experience had left its mark. Every unfamiliar face seemed suspicious. Every odd occurrence felt like a prelude to something more sinister. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The sun was shining, and the neighborhood was bustling with activity. Kids playing, dogs barking, people mowing their lawns. It was the epitome of suburban peace, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I strolled through the park, I noticed a man sitting on a bench, seemingly engrossed in his phone. Nothing unusual except that every time I looked his way, he seemed to be looking back. I brushed it off as paranoia, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Later that day, Jake called me with an edge of panic in his voice. "Dude, I think I'm being followed," he said, his words rushed and breathless. "What? Are you sure?" I replied, my own anxiety spiking. "I'm not positive, but there's this car that's been parked outside my house for hours, and I've seen the same guy around town a few times now. I don't know, maybe I'm just being paranoid." "Stay calm," I said, trying to reassure both of us. "We'll figure this out. Meet me at the cafe in an hour. We need to talk in person." We met at the cafe, our usual spot in the corner, feeling both comforting and exposed. Jake looked visibly shaken, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. "I've been thinking," he began, leaning in closer. "What if this isn't just about scaring us? What if they're trying to intimidate us into silence?" I nodded, the same thought having crossed my mind more than once. We need to document everything. If something happens, we need evidence. Over the next few days, we took meticulous notes of every odd occurrence, every unfamiliar face, every suspicious vehicle. We installed security cameras around our homes and made sure our phones were always charged and ready to record. One evening, as I was reviewing the footage from my security cameras, I noticed something chilling. There, in the grainy footage, was a figure standing across the street, partially obscured by the shadows. The person didn't move, just stood there, watching my house. My heart pounded as I quickly saved the footage and called Jake. "Jake, you need to see this. I think we've got proof." He came over immediately, and we reviewed the footage together. The figure was indistinct, but it was clear enough to confirm our fears. Someone was watching us. "This is it," Jake said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We need to take this to the police. They can't ignore it now." The next morning, armed with our notes and the footage, we returned to the police station. The officers listened carefully as we presented our evidence. Their expressions grew more serious with each passing minute. "This is concerning," one of the detectives said, his brow furrowed. We'll increase patrols in your neighborhoods and keep an eye on your properties. But I also suggest you remain vigilant and continue documenting anything unusual." We thanked them and left, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. It was comforting to know the police were taking us seriously, but the sense of unease lingered. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. Around midnight I got up and checked the security footage again. The same figure was there, standing in the shadows, watching. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't going to stop. Whoever was behind Watcher 42 was determined and relentless. They wanted us to know they were always watching, always one step ahead. I decided to confront the figure. Armed with my phone to record and a flashlight, I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the spot where the figure had been standing, I called out, "Who's there? What do you want?" There was no response. I shined the flashlight around, but the figure had vanished. All that remained was a sense of foreboding and a chilling certainty that we were being toyed with. I returned to the house, my mind racing. This wasn't just about fear anymore, it was about control. Whoever was behind this wanted us to feel powerless, to know that they could reach us anytime, anywhere. The next day, I met with Jake again, determined to come up with a plan. We decided to seek help from a cybersecurity expert, someone who could help us track down the origins of the threats and secure our digital lives. Through a mutual friend, we were introduced to Claire, a brilliant and somewhat eccentric cybersecurity specialist. She listened intently as we recounted our story, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "I've dealt with cases like this before," she said finally. "These people thrive on anonymity and fear. But they're not invincible. Give me access to your devices and accounts, and I'll see what I can find." We handed over everything, placing our trust in Claire. She assured us that it would take time, but she was confident she could uncover something useful. As we left her office, I felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in weeks, it seemed like we were taking back some control. But the road ahead was uncertain, and the shadows of the dark web still loomed large. The days turned into weeks as we waited for Claire's findings. Every ring of the phone, every unexpected knock at the door, sent waves of anxiety through me. But we held on, knowing that the only way out of this nightmare was to face it head on. Finally, Claire called us with news. Her voice was calm but laced with urgency. "I found something," she said. "Meet me at your place, and I'll explain everything." We gathered at my house, the tension palpable. Claire arrived with a laptop and a folder full of documents. She took a deep breath before diving into her explanation. "What I found is disturbing, but it's also a breakthrough. The network behind Watcher 42 is more extensive than we thought. They use multiple layers of encryption and proxy servers to mask their activities, but I managed to trace some connections." She pulled up a series of charts and graphs on her laptop, detailing the intricate web of connections. Watcher 42 is not just one person, it's a collective. They share information and resources to target individuals who dig too deep or pose a threat to their anonymity. But here's the good news. I found a weak link. One of their proxies led me to a physical server location. Jake and I exchanged a glance, a mix of hope and fear. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We have a choice," Claire replied. "We can report this to the authorities, who can raid the location and hopefully shut down their operations. Or we can use this information to negotiate, make it clear that we have the means to expose them if they don't leave you alone." The days following the raid were a mix of relief and lingering unease. The authorities assured us that the arrests had significantly disrupted the network behind Watcher 42, but Jake and I knew better than to let our guard down completely. The dark web had many layers, and we had only scratched the surface. Claire stayed in touch, offering her continued support and monitoring our digital security. She was confident that the major threat had been neutralized, but she advised us to remain cautious. We took her advice to heart, implementing stronger security measures and being mindful of our online activities. Life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Jake and I resumed our routines, but the experience had left us both more wary and vigilant. We kept an eye out for anything unusual, but thankfully, the ominous presence that had once loomed over us seemed to fade. One evening, a few months after the raid, Jake and I decided to catch up over dinner at our favorite restaurant. It felt good to relax and enjoy each other's company without the weight of constant fear. "I still can't believe we went through all that," Jake said, shaking his head. "It feels like a bad dream." "Yeah, but we made it through," I replied, raising my glass in a toast. "Here's to putting the past behind us." As we clinked glasses, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Claire. I opened it, curious about what she had to say. "Hey, just wanted to check in and let you know that everything's been quiet on my end. Looks like the raid really did the trick. Stay safe and let me know if you need anything." I showed the message to Jake, who grinned. "Good to hear. I guess we can finally start to relax." Just as we were settling into a sense of peace, an older couple at the table next to us struck up a conversation. They were friendly and curious, asking about our lives and sharing stories of their own. It was a pleasant distraction from the tension of the past few months. As we chatted, the topic of internet safety came up. The couple's grandson had recently been a victim of cyberbullying, and they were worried about how to protect him online. Jake and I shared some of the lessons we had learned, emphasizing the importance of strong passwords, secure networks, and being cautious about sharing personal information. The conversation was a reminder of how pervasive and interconnected our digital lives had become. It was also a chance to reflect on the positives that had come from our ordeal, the knowledge we had gained, and the connections we had forged. After dinner, Jake and I walked back to our cars. The cool evening air refreshing and calming. We stood in the parking lot for a moment, savoring the sense of normalcy. "You know," Jake said, "we should do something with what we've learned. Maybe start a blog or a YouTube channel about internet safety. Share our story and help others avoid what we went through." I nodded, considering the idea. "That's not a bad idea. We could turn this whole experience into something positive." And so we did. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I started working on a blog, sharing our story and offering tips on digital security. We reached out to Claire for her expertise, and she gladly contributed her knowledge. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People appreciated our honesty and the practical advice we provided. Through this project, we found a new purpose. The fear and anxiety that had once dominated our lives began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of empowerment and community. We were no longer victims of the dark web. We had become advocates for a safer internet. One afternoon, as I was reviewing comments on our latest blog post, I received a message from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She had read our story and was deeply moved by it. Her message was a heartfelt reminder of the impact we could have by sharing our experiences. "Your story reminded me that even in the darkest times, there's always a way forward. Thank you for being brave and turning your nightmare into a source of strength for others." I smiled, feeling a warmth that had been absent for too long. The journey had been harrowing, but it had also led us to a place of growth and resilience. As the months turned into years, Jake and I continued our advocacy work, always remembering the lessons we had learned. The dark web was a place of shadows, but it had also illuminated the strength of our friendship and the importance of vigilance in the digital age. In the end, we had not only survived our ordeal, but had emerged stronger, ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold. And with each step forward, we knew that the best way to combat the darkness was to shine a light, sharing our story and helping others navigate the complex, ever-changing world of the internet.